Hi, thanks for tuning in. I'm Paul Zimmy Finn. This is the Generation Report. 4 years ago, just before the 2020 election, HBO released a documentary called The Soul of America. The documentary's name, now a familiar phrase, was taken from a book of the same title by the presidential historian John Meacham, and presented Meacham in various stages of sermonizing about American history, mostly with regard to race and episodes of racial prejudice. Although President Trump was invoked only briefly and mentioned by name only once, the message delivered by the Soul of America was unmistakable. Everything good and decent was riding on the outcome of the forthcoming election, so it was an imperative that Americans make the right choice. 2 presidential elections later, what have we learned about the Soul of America? That depends on who you ask.
Last night, I was thinking, oh my gosh, is that Madison Square Garden rally, is that the Soul of America now?
All day yesterday, I was walking around proudly wearing my I voted sticker. Today, I wore my I am questioning my fundamental belief in the goodness of humanity sticker.
Let's be honest, it was a terrible night last night. It was a terrible night for women, for children, for the hundreds of thousands of hardworking immigrants who make this country go.
I mean, who were we to believe that America would ever elect a woman, let alone a black and Asian woman as its president? I mean, sure, Mexico just did it, but not us. We're America. We don't do these things.
I'm worried about mass deportation and internment camps.
We are the only 248-year-old multiracial, pluralistic democracy in the world. And shall we keep it? A lot of our fellow Americans say we shouldn't. Now we know. Now we know for sure.
Make America great again. Well, there are a lot of problems with that.
Who are we as a country? And we're starting to find out. And from what I'm seeing right now, I'm not sure I like it.
So we've lost, but we lost a battle. The war is not over.
So now we can work full-time on being fricking pirates.
And so, as a large swath of America begins to mount another resistance, led, we can only assume, by some of the most powerful people in our country and endorsed subtly or not so subtly by scores of less powerful but still prominent people, it seems fair to ask with respect to this group, are they really championing a defense of democracy, as they so often claim, or are they merely shifting tactics to keep a toehold on their claim to their own superiority? To answer this question, I think it's best to start by drawing on the writings of 3 especially brilliant people who've influenced this podcast. In his book, The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, Christopher Lasch contends that the great divide which emerged in America late in the 20th century was between people who were in professional managerial occupations and people who were not. More than simply a matter of a space becoming dominated by people of similar educational status, the professional managerial sphere became its own distinct culture, one in which critical discourse was applied to what Lasch called the interpretation and deployment of symbolic information. As this group reaped the benefits of an economy which disproportionately rewarded them, they created networks and concentrated in geographical areas which converted their economic clout into cultural dominance. At the same time, Thomas Sowell writes in his book Intellectuals in Society, the people with the most prized specialized knowledge within the sphere of credentialed professionals accrued a level of influence and prestige they had never known previously. Gradually, this class of experts brought its own self-serving conceptions of reason and truth to bear on education, on the public sector, and on the public's understanding of the issues. And all the while, the distance between the people occupying America's top heights of political leadership and cultural preeminence on one side and ordinary Americans on the other grew so wide their priorities became completely different. As Angelo Codevilla observed throughout his years writing about the American ruling class, preempting consideration of the insights and concerns of ordinary Americans became almost a prerequisite for those who sought admission into that class. Here's what brings these developments together. For years, the broader establishment in American society has had the practical effect of stratifying people into those who are accepted, either on account of their credentials, their siding with the right issues, or their fitting in with the right people, and those who are not accepted. A great many people on the fortunate end of this status quo have been conditioned to believe they are the deserving winners in a meritocratic struggle, and that their success is a testament not just to their own hard work, but to their own knowledge and virtue. The tendency to slip into the presumption of being especially knowledgeable and virtuous is as old as human beings. But when that presumption becomes a hallmark exhibited by lots of people who reach a certain level of social and professional status, it's reasonable to conclude that a certain intertwining of social and professional status has created a class which sees itself as superior. And one thing we learned from this election, to the presumptively superior, it's probably never more important to assert claims on their own superiority than it is when they're wrong. All this dovetails to someone whose name has been in the news a lot recently. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Alan Lichtman.
My prediction system is unique, and as you said, it's been essentially right for 40 years. I would say 10 of 10, but we're not going to relitigate 2000 here. Kamala Harris will be a precedent-breaking president of the United States. My predictions have stood the test of time. The keys are the North Star, the unchanging system. I just predict winners and losers. But the pollsters, they just give you these meaningless probabilities. My predictions are totally nonpartisan. They have nothing to do with my political views. If I predicted according to my political views, I'd be useless. I wouldn't have correctly called the last 10 elections.
This is Lichtman Live, post-Trump 2024 victory. Wow.
I made a statement to the media. I admit I was wrong. I called a Harris win, and she didn't win. But I was far, far from the only forecaster to be wrong. I think the fundamental problem was the keys, not my interpretation. No one's convinced me that was wrong. We've always had disinformation, but disinformation has exploded to an unprecedented degree because the keys depend upon a rational, pragmatic electorate deciding based on governance whether the incumbent party should get 4 more years. Starts with Fox News and conservative media, conservative podcasters with tens of millions of views. Misogyny, racism, and xenophobia. But we've seen something brand new this time. The 300 billionaire Elon Musk putting his thumb on the scales through his control of X. It was some 10 million Biden voters who decided not to vote this time, and that's directly tied to misinformation. There is misinformation about everything about the economy, inflation, jobs, unemployment, the stock market, growth. There is vast disinformation about undocumented immigrants that extends to the war in Ukraine, reproductive rights, foreign policy, hurricane aid. The mainstream media spent more time on useless polls, 10 times more time on useless polls than dealing with misinformation. That calls into question the whole premise behind the keys and behind our democracy.
I think what I'm saying is that both sides can say things like this, like misinformation. It's hard to quantify that.
If you don't let me make my points, why do you have me on?
All right, we're done.
We're done.
I think we'd love...
let me talk. What's the point? Are you the expert or am I the expert?
Look, we all make predictions that don't turn out the way we expect. But it shouldn't escape anyone as to what Lichtman's instinctive pivot to the blame game for his poor prediction is really about. Lichtman has lived most of his life priding himself on his special understanding of something he considers very important, and the recognition of his insights has given him both connections in one of the most glamorous cities in the world and a pedestal to continually dispense his wisdom through the media to an ostensibly uninformed public. In short, Alan Lichtman believes he's smarter and better than you. And his connection to American University makes his reaction meaningful for me, because I went to American University. I suspect it's not unusual for people who live in Washington, D.C., as I did for 2.5 years, to have lots of encounters with people who are ready at a moment's notice to read their resumes or give a speech about how much specialized knowledge they have. And of course, you also get lots of people there who talk about democracy or the Constitution as if they had discovered one or the other. But while D.C. is definitely its own bubble, it hasn't split off from the rest of America yet. And in Lichtman, I recognize a twin phenomenon which I think has indisputably been increasing throughout our society for years. The self-pedestalization of people who believe they've surpassed the world around them, and the self-aggrandizement of people bent on asserting superiority over those they see as inferior. Victor Davis Hanson gave his insights about this in a conversation with Megyn Kelly earlier this year.
the bicoastal elite, they became utopian and they came up with these crazy ideas. They never were subject to the consequences of their own ideology. They just experimented on the losers of globalization. This wealthy group hasn't really been examined, and because they own the media and academia, K through 12, entertainment, the corporate boardroom, the popular culture, they're really exempt from really introspection on who they are, what their values are. But I think they've been a very pernicious influence on this country. They have high self-regard for themselves. And I see them on the Stanford campus hourly. And it's just a relief to get away from them because they're very judgmental, and yet they're very proud of their generation, and they're very critical of the dead. And when you look at what they've accomplished, and I don't see San Francisco better than it was 30 years ago or 50 years ago. And I don't see the universities, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, as pillars of intellectual inquiry and freedom of thought compared to 1940 or 50. So I don't really see what they're basing their high self-regard on, given what they've done to the country.
I've said before that America is now divided by entirely different conceptions of reality, and the reactions to President Trump's victory definitely bore that out. But one noticeable aspect of the post-election coverage and the pre-election buildup this year was that the level of condescension seemed far greater than in 2016 and 2020. Obviously, the condescension that gets transmitted through the media is somewhat different from the condescension of people who've built careers and reputations as credentialed experts, or, for that matter, from the kind of condescension characteristic of out-of-touch celebrities or powerful politicians. But since this election generated such a clear putting down vibe from people across the political, cultural, media, professional, managerial establishment, I believe that says something important about the reality divide we see. There is one remarkable passage in The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy where Christopher Lasch connects the contemporary American class structure to the changes we associate with the 1960s. It's too long to read here, but the gist of Lasch's argument is basically this. In the wake of the enormous political and social upheavals that took place in the 60s, certain ideas spread from the counterculture to the mainstream, then to education and the professions, in a way that forever changed culture, education, and the professions from the inside. Once professionals of every description joined cultural elites in embracing the notion of self-defined truth, the transmission of trends in information and ideas became indistinct from the shifting truths embraced by a particular segment of the population. What worried Lasch as he was writing in the early 1990s was that the knowledge economy elites had become so unmoored from the perspectives of non-professionals, the resulting class divide was more akin to a reality divide which might one day threaten democracy itself. 30 years on, Lasch was obviously prescient about what the rise of the credentialed professionals class might mean for America's economic and political divide. Yet I argue his insight about self-defined notions of truth is the most important. Here's why. The idea that truth can be entirely self-defined was the imprint of lasting significance left on America by the changes of the 1960s. Once old standards of objective truth gave way to the new emphasis on subjective truth, the value of having specialized knowledge, influence within the culture, proximity to power, and a certain kind of moral clarity all increased exponentially, becoming in essence their own truths. But for as much impact as this change had on American society generally, its impact on the American establishment was transformative. And this, I believe, accounts for much of the reason we have the reality divide we have today. Back in the 1960s, as Strauss and Howe point out in The Fourth Turning, the term establishment connoted a particular group of leaders whose hallmark was their aura of rationality and competence, at least until they lost the public's trust anyway. Today, we understand the establishment to be a cross-section of people and institutions who share the spoils of preeminence and power. And what is that preeminence and power based upon now? Upon the belief in and commitment to preeminence and power for their own sake, reinforced by a mostly self-created aura of superior knowledge and virtue. But superior knowledge and virtue in relation to who or what? In relation to the rest of the American people. This is the core belief America's establishment adopted a long time ago. This is what forms the basis of its reality today. And herein lies the practical problem America is now facing. The people who covered themselves in glory all the way through the 2024 election cycle and its aftermath with gaslighting and deflection and condescension really do believe they're better than the rest of us. I don't know what our presumed betters will do next, but the one thing I know for sure is they must not be underestimated. In the next episode, I'll discuss the ideas of the person who set the foundation for the establishment's resistance mindset and maybe speculate on what might be ahead. Thank you so much for listening. May God bless America.